Today we're going to be going over the Surging Spark meta decks going into the Sacramento Regional Tournament. We're going to talk about how strong each one of these decks are, and we're going to give it a ranking based on the potential finish I could see it having. We're going to start things off with the Goldingo deck. I honestly almost want to throw Goldingo into S tier. It's very, very strong into the current meta and doesn't have a lot of weaknesses, has good draw power. Depends on what kind of tech cards you put in it. Do you play the Scizor? Do you play the Togekiss? I think that Goldingo with the new Energy Search Pro is a very, very solid A tier deck right now, and I would not be surprised to see one sneak into the top 8. I don't believe it has top 4 or winning potential, but if I saw one in 7th or 8th place going into top cut, I wouldn't be surprised at all. Chien Pao Iron Hand, just D tier deck. It's just too slow, too inconsistent. You just take out the Baxcalibur and the deck just doesn't work anymore. There's easier and faster ways to set up Iron Hands if you want to utilize its ampy very much attack. Just D tier deck, it could win some games, but you're not going to go very far. I don't see any of these decks making it to day 2 at the Sacramento Regional. I would be very surprised if a single one of these made it to day 2. Iron Thorns, solid B tier deck. It could be S tier if you flip all heads with your coin flips, D tier if you flip all tails. Just depends on your matchups and your coin flips. I think going into the current meta, there's a lot of abilities in the current format, but there's also a ton of decks that don't have abilities, and you're going to struggle against a lot of those. You're going to struggle against Lost Box. You're going to struggle against Gouging Fire. You're going to struggle into a lot of these new popular decks. You're going to struggle into Raging Bolt. I just don't see it going any higher than a B tier deck. I do see the potential of maybe one of these decks sneaking into top 8, kind of like with Goldingo, just based on somebody getting the luck of the draw and just having good matchups throughout. With Lugia becoming less and less popular, this deck actually just becomes worse and worse as that deck becomes less and less popular. It's one of its best matchups, and we're just not going to see as much Lugia as we did in previous tournaments. I'm going to put it in B tier just because it does have the potential to sneak in the top 8 depending on matchups it hits. We have Dragapult with Tatsugiri. I think that's a solid A tier deck right now. Dragapult's just so strong. The problem is if you play it with Pidgeot, we do have a Pidgeot build here. We're going to slide that into B tier. Pidgeot is going to fall victim to the increase in electric decks, the increase in Pikachu, increase in Miraidon, and it's just not going to have a good time against those decks, which are going to see a massive spike in usage at the Sacramento Regional Tournament. I think the ceiling for Dragapult is probably top 32. I think we'll see a few of these make it into day 2. I think the majority of them will be the Tatsugiri, non-Pidgeot build, and we may see 1 or 2 of the Pidgeot build sneak in depending on the matchups that they hit. We have Roaring Moon with Koraidon. That's actually the wrong Koraidon. There's a new Koraidon from Surging Sparks that's actually pretty strong. Does 180 damage for 2 energy, and it depends. I mean, this might be one of the better meta calls to take to the Sacramento Regional Tournament. If you expect to hit a lot of Lost Zone Box, you're going to have a really, really good time with the Roaring Moon deck. If you see nothing but big stage 2 decks, you're going to have a bad time. So it just kind of depends on your matchups. I think that we're going to see a massive increase in decks such as Snorlax Stall. We're going to see a massive increase in decks such as Lost Zone Box. I think that this is going to go into the C tier, and I think it does have like a cap of top 64. Honestly, you're just not going to hit enough good matchups, and you're not going to have good enough starts. This deck is very prone to just bricking and not performing very well. I think that we could see a couple, one make it in the top 64, maybe a couple in day 2, but it just doesn't have that overall upside of winning a regional tournament. Dialga V-Star has won a regional tournament before with Matang. I think Andrew Hedrick was the pilot on that one. If this was the Archaludon build with Dialga, I would probably put it into C tier, but with just straight Dialga V-Star, Star Chronos only does 220 damage. Most of the basic Pokemon right now, EX Pokemon, have 230 or more HP, so it kind of struggles into those type of decks. You can go after the support Pokemon with Star Chronos. You could take 4 prizes pretty easily with this deck. It's just all based on setup and matchups. I just don't think that it's going to have a very good performance. And if any of these make it into day 2, I'd be very surprised. Might see one, but it's not going to be a very high performing or even a high meta share deck to be able to get enough results. I think Gouging Fire is a really good meta call going into this upcoming tournament. I think that Gouging Fire does have the potential to be, I honestly want to put it in like an A tier. it has so much HP, it does so much damage. You are able to use Monkey Dory to move damage off of it after utilizing Magma Basin. Does health offset the 60 damage attack. You can play Entei in this deck. It's very, very strong. There's a lot of Area Zero running around, which makes Entei stronger. You can play Brave Charms, give it more HP. I'm honestly going to throw this into, high B tier. And I think this is one of the more underrated decks in the format right now. I think it's just underexplored. And I think if somebody came up with a very, very solid list, we could see this have a very good performance. I would put this, the cap on this deck probably top 32. I just don't think there's going to be very many of these at the tournament, but I could see one going on a really, really hot run and, performing very well just because it is such a strong deck. I would actually play this over Raging Bolt going into Sacramento. Lost Zone Pikachu, it feels so good. Lost Zone Pikachu feels so dominant right now. I mean, whenever I practice with this, I usually take 4, if not 6 prizes with Pikachu. I mean, you just save your Super Rods, you save your Mirage Gates, and you just cycle through the Pikachu EX back-to-back turns. If your opponent doesn't have a way to deal with its ability, they're just going to lose. They have to be able to Monkey Dory, they have to be able to, Hawlucha or Dragapult, get some sort of damage on this deck. Canceling Cologne is going to be a big tech card because of Pikachu. I think going into Sacramento, this is going to see a very, very high meta share, even with Regidrago probably being the best deck in the format. I think that we're going to see a massive influx of Lost Zone box decks thanks to Pikachu EX. Gardevoir, I think Gardevoir is probably one of the best decks, most, underrated decks, considering how powerful it is. I know that it does have a lot of respect in the community, but it's just not played very much. And I just don't think there's going to be enough of a player base playing this deck because there's going to be so much Lost Box, there's going to be so much Iron Hands, Miraidon that this deck just really struggles into. I just don't see this deck being played enough to have the high results. But if this deck popped into... Honestly, if this deck popped in the top 8, I wouldn't be surprised whatsoever. I could see the Pikachu Lost Box winning the whole tournament. I think we could see multiple of these in the top 8. I think this is probably the deck that you need to prepare to play against the most at this upcoming tournament. Between this and Regidrago, you need to be able to beat those two matchups. I know we skipped over the ranking a little bit, but we're going to go back to it. I could see multiple of these in top 8, and I could see this deck winning the tournament. Going back to our Gardevoir deck, if one of these popped in the top 8, I wouldn't be surprised. Gardevoir is just so powerful. Just the current meta is not good for it. The current meta with Lost Box, Iron Hands, just those two types of decks just are really bad for Gardevoir. I'm going to put it in C tier for the current meta, but based on overall power, probably be somewhere in the B tier. Not a deck I would take to the Sacramento Regionals based on what I expect to be there. Lost Zone Giratina, well, I don't know why this is on here. This is a D tier deck. I mean, it works. Giratina V-Star does 280. Cramorant's good. Sableye's good, but you might as well just play the Pikachu build and just have a better time. Lugia with Cinccino. Lugia, when it works, is probably the best deck in the format. When it doesn't work, it could be the worst deck. It's kind of like Iron Thorns. It could be S tier, it could be D tier, depending on how fast you get your Archetypes in the discard. We're going to see a massive influx of Electric-type Pokemon, which is really, really going to hurt Lugia. Based on overall power, it's an A tier deck. Based on the meta going into Sacramento, I'm going to put this in B tier. I think it does have a cap of probably top 32, top 16. I just don't see very many of these getting enough good matchups to actually make it far in the tournament. There's going to be too many Miraidon, too many Pikachu Lost Box decks, and it just doesn't beat enough of the other decks to get enough wins to make it, into Top Cut and beyond. Basically, auto loss to Iron Thorns. There's just so many decks that just beat Lugia, and it's so prone to bricking. Somebody could go on a hot run with it for sure. I don't see it making it past top 32, top 16 in this upcoming format. Sablezard's one of my favorite Lost Box archetypes. It's a lot of fun to play. You play 2 or 3 Sableyes, you really lean on Charizard cleaning up those big basic Pokemon or going after their support Pokemon. The problem is it's so inconsistent. Radiant Greninja provides so much support and so much power. Concealed cards, Moonlight Shuriken provides pressure to your opponent. There's just no way that you should play Charizard in your Lost Box deck over Radiant Greninja. It's night and day whenever you play the two decks. If you get Colress in every single turn, sure, Sablezard could be so strong, but how often does that happen with Lost Box? I'm going to put that in a solid C tier deck. I could see a couple of these popping up in the day 2. Top 64 wouldn't be surprising. Anything higher than that, I just don't see it. All right, going to Miraidon. I think Miraidon's actually going to have one of the highest increases in popularity in the overall meta percentage. I think that it is a solid A tier deck in this format. Let's go ahead and organize these based on where I think they're at. I'd play Lugia over Gardevoir, honestly. And I would play Sablezard over Roaring Moon. I'd honestly play Giratina over these right here. That's kind of the order I would put it in. But Miraidon, A tier deck. Whenever you get the right matchups, this deck just steamrolls your opponent. If you play into Lost Box, you get Iron Hand set up, you could win very, very quickly. If you get matches such as, Raging Bolt, Roaring Moon EX, the big basic decks, Miraidon can just run those types of decks over. If you add Raichu, you could deal with the big, stage 2 Pokemon as well. I'm not a fan of Miraidon. I'm just not a fan. There's just so many weaknesses to this deck. I know it does get a big boost, with Latios. It does get a boost with Area Zero, Pikachu. You should add in a Grass and Metal Energy to try and utilize Pikachu potentially in your matchup. I just don't see this deck as a viable, S tier deck. I see it as a solid A tier deck, and I could see a couple of these making it into top 8. It wouldn't surprise me at all if we looked at the top cut and we had 2 or 3, even 3 of these into top 8. I think it's going to have a massive meta share, which is going to give it more potential. And I think a lot of really good players are going to bring the Miraidon deck to the Sacramento Regionals to take advantage of Lost Zone Box and its increased popularity. Iron Hands just farms Lost Box, and it farms Gardevoir. It farms these, smaller decks if they don't get evolved. Problem being Charizard. I think Charizard is going to have a massive meta share. It's just going to be a constant threat. I think it's going to have too much. This is kind of a hard placement. Charizard is an A tier deck for sure. And whenever you flip over Charmander and your opponent flips over Miraidon, normally the Miraidon player's like, dang it. Because it's just not a good matchup, and I think there's just going to be too much Charizard to keep Miraidon in check, honestly. I could see, 1-2 Charizards making the top 8. I could see Charizard winning the whole tournament. Would not be surprising at all. The tried and true decks are going to kind of rise to the top in this first tournament. That Surging Sparks is legal. That's usually how it works. People are wanting to try out the new decks. The new decks aren't fully cooked, and you just get cooked because you're playing an undercooked deck. But Charizard and Miraidon, I think, are going to be very high in the meta share. And with Charizard having the advantage over Miraidon, I think that it's going to kind of keep Miraidon down. But like I said, any of these A tier decks, I wouldn't be surprised to see in top cut. Let's reorganize these. Dragapult, we're going to move down. You know what? We're actually going to leave Miraidon ahead of Charizard. I just think there's going to be more good players playing Miraidon. I think there's going to be more players playing Charizard overall. But the quality of those players is probably going to be lower, which is going to result in some, bad records. Just going to be honest. Goldingo, Dragapult, Charizard, Miraidon, I could see all those being in top 8. I could see Charizard, Miraidon winning the tournament. I would not be surprised at all to see one of those winning the tournament. Palkia Dusknoir suffers from Lost Zone Box being really, really strong right now, and it also suffers from Miraidon being really, really popular. Struggles with Iron Hands, struggles with just electric types in general. It can one-hit KO Palkia with ease. It's a powerful deck, but in the current meta, B tier. I think for both archetypes, B tier. And I would not bring these archetypes to the Sacramento Regional Tournament because of the other decks that are going to be powerful, going to be very, very heavily played. Miraidon and Pikachu Lost Box are going to demolish Palkia V-Star decks. It's not going to be pretty. And you don't have enough good matchups into everything else to really justify playing these decks over really any of these other decks above it. Pidgeot Control, I'm a firm believer that this is just a bad deck. The reason you see this deck having good results on Limitless TCG online tournaments is because it's open deck list. So the person who's playing the Pidgeot Control can just be like, all right, you have this many switch cards, you have this many energy, and this is what I'm going to do. And as soon as they see in your discard pile, the exact number of cards that is in your open deck list, they can just take advantage of that. If they don't know what's in your deck, it's really hard for them to choose the optimal route, to play. I mean, you could take good guesses. If you're playing Charizard, you probably want to get rid of their energies. If you're playing Lost Box, you probably want to try and get rid of their switch cards, pull out Pokemon with abilities to play your Ogerpon. I'm going to put this in D tier. like low D tier. It's just a bad deck. If you have an open deck list, it's completely different than playing in an in-person tournament where you don't know what your opponent has, and it's just it's a bad deck. Without open deck list, it's just a bad deck. Raging Bolt is going to be, I think it's going to be super strong. I think it's going to be very heavily played, which is going to lead it to have some good results. I could see Raging Bolt easily make it into top 8. If there was 2 in top 8, wouldn't be surprised at all. I think that, I mean, it could even win the tournament. I think that Raging Bolt, if it gets hot, it runs so hot. It can do so much damage so fast, it could just overwhelm your opponent. And if there's a lot of Charizard and a lot of Miraidon in the top cut with it, I could see Raging Bolt just taking over. If there's a lot of Pikachu Lost Box, it's just going to struggle heavily. Pikachu Lost Box is basically a free matchup into Raging Bolt, it feels like. Pikachu just absolutely demolishes this deck. You could play Slitherwing. It does help a little bit, but it just doesn't fix it enough. Regidrago V-Star still, S tier deck. I'm going to actually put that at the top over Pikachu just because it has Kyurem. I mean, I could see any of these decks teching Kyurem just because Lost Box is going to be such a threat at the Sacramento Regional. Snorlax stall. I hate giving this a good ranking. I could see Snorlax winning the whole tournament. I really, really could. I could see Snorlax just winning. People like to play new decks, and when you take new decks with, undercooked lists that don't respect Snorlax, you'll see a 1% to 2% meta share and, a very high day 2 conversion rate with this deck. And I could see it winning the whole tournament because people just don't respect it. I don't personally like this deck. I feel like this deck shouldn't even exist. The block Snorlax is a disgustingly toxic card that should have never even been printed. And with Accompanying Flute, Counter Catcher, the Cornerstone Ogerpon, Mimikyus, there's just so many cards that shouldn't even be able to be played together. It's a solid A tier deck list. Unfortunately. Unfortunately. So we're going to have to respect Snorlax. You need to play Canceling Clones. You need to play Switching Options. You need to play Turo. Something to be able to get around this deck. You shouldn't tech your deck out to the point where it becomes inconsistent against everything else because it is going to be such a low meta share. You could go the entire tournament without seeing one of these. But if you get in the top cut and you don't have an answer for Snorlax, Snorlax could easily take down the whole tournament. Don't like to say that, but it's just the truth. Bayonet Item Lock. This is a weird deck right now because against Lost Zone, it's actually pretty good. Against Lost Zone, it's actually pretty good. I think we're going to put it in C tier, though. I think we're going to put it in kind of the higher C tier. I think this deck could surprise a lot of people, make it into day 2, could probably get into top 128 pretty easily. I think the ceiling would be probably, if I saw one at top 16, I'd be surprised. So probably top 32 would be kind of the cap on this deck, in my opinion. I think that it's going to be really good into the current meta in Sacramento. I don't think it's a very amazing deck overall, but there's a lot of item-heavy decks that are really, really good right now. Lost Zone Box, even Regidrago V-Star relies heavily on Energy Switch. It relies heavily on Earthen Vessel, just a lot of items in general. So you could take advantage of the current meta that's very item-heavy. And, I mean, this deck could be pretty good. It could be pretty strong. It just depends on the quality of player who takes this deck to the tournament. This is going to be like one of those off-the-page deck lists that, it's going to be less than 1%. But if somebody who's really, really talented brings this deck, it could make it into day 2, could go pretty far. I just don't see it having top cut potential. Roaring Moon EX is just a bad deck. I love Roaring Moon EX. I've tried so hard to make this deck work. I love turbo decks. I love attacking. I love the Frenzied Gouging attack. It's just a bad deck. It bricks. It's just... I mean, we'll put it at the top of D tier here, but it's just a bad deck. Play something else. Play something else. Save yourself the headache of playing Roaring Moon into this current format. You're going to have a bad time. You're going to be like, man, I should have just played something else. It's going to feel like you wasted your time. Ceruledge, I actually think this is a very, very low skill level deck, which could see a lot of play. I mean, if you have a lot of people playing a deck and they hit the right matchups, they could make it really far. I could see this deck potentially making it into, I think it's an A tier deck. I honestly think, like, you have to play the right list. You have to play Palkia, you have to play Radiant Greninja to be able to get around like Mimikyu and things like that, or you have to play doubling Canceling Cologne. If you play the right list, I think this deck is just so easy to play that you're going to have just an easier time at a regional tournament. It's a very long tournament. So playing something that's just easier to play than, say, Lost Box, you're not going to have as much mental fatigue. You're not going to be, it's just an easier deck. So I could see that just, it could just be a winning deck. Best 2 out of 3, you just run your opponent over, kind of like Raging Bolt. I think you have a few more options here. You just kind of have to be careful of Mimikyu. I mean, you have to save enough energies to be able to use your Radiant Greninja if you know your opponent's playing Mimikyu, or you just play double canceling Cologne, and that usually can help you get through an entire match. Jamming Tower helps a lot too. I think this is a solid A tier deck. I honestly think that this is going to perform better than Goldingo and Dragapult. It's easy. It's an easy deck. It's an easy deck. We're going to move on. I just think it's well positioned because it's such an easy deck to play. Hydreigon, I think we haven't figured out the list. I think until we figure out the list, we have to put it in D tier. Once we figure out the list, this could, move up the rankings, could be a solid B tier deck. I think right now it's just a D tier deck. We don't know if we want to use its first attack or if we want to build it around the Obsidian attack. I think this deck is more powerful built around the Obsidian attack. Doing 130 damage to 3 Pokemon is absurd until everyone starts playing Manaphy, which is a big thing. Like, if you're going to Sacramento, please, please, please play Manaphy. Do not be caught without Manaphy in this current meta. Archaludon, if this is just straight Archaludon, I think this is just a B tier list. Sets up really well, hits for 220. You could play Starmie, offset some damage. If it's the Archaludon with Dialga, I think it could be a little bit higher in B tier, but it would still be a B tier deck. This is like a lower end B tier deck in my opinion. I would probably maybe even push it down to C tier. Probably at the top of C tier, honestly. And it wouldn't be a bad play. I mean, I could see this deck easily making it. I can see it make it day 2. I don't see it making it past, top 64. I feel like if I saw one of these higher than top 64, I'd be a little surprised. Terapagos, Dusknoir is just a bad deck. Terapagos, I don't know. People are trying to make it work with Dusknoir. It's a bad deck. It's not as good as people try to make it seem. I mean, it's just a bad deck. I don't know how else to explain it. Like, every time I play this deck, it feels terrible. And giving your opponent prize cards right now with Lost Box running around, with all these, really strong decks running around, it feels bad. You only have 230 HP. Even if you play the Bouffalance, it's still not enough. Milotic, Noivern Wall, I think is a C tier deck, but the people who bring it are going to be very good. I think that if you bring this, you're going to be a very skilled player and you can make it work in the current format. If you see a lot of Miraidon, you see a lot of the, these V and EX decks, you could easily, perform pretty well. I could see this deck actually making it into day 2. Wouldn't be surprised at all. Make it top cut? Absolutely no way. I think there's some more work to be done on this list. Somebody could bring a list that we've never seen before and have, a better time with it than what we're expecting. It's borderline a D tier deck, but we're going to leave it in C for right now. Just going over our tier list here: Regidrago, Pikachu, Lost Box, S tier; Miraidon, Charizard, Raging Bolt, Blocklax, Ceruledge, Goldingo, Dragapult. Any of these decks I wouldn't be surprised to see in top cut. B tier is kind of where we start seeing decks that I would be surprised to see in top cut, but I wouldn't be surprised to see in the top 16. And, it's top 16 to top 128. C tier is kind of like, day 2, top 128 is where I see them kind of fizzling out. D tier decks, don't play them to Sacramento. You're not going to have a good time. You could if you're just going for fun, play your favorite deck, play what you want to play. But if you're going to win, these are not the decks that you want to bring to win the Sacramento Regional Tournament. Let me know what you guys think of these tier lists. Let me know what you think of the Surging Sparks meta in general. YouTube says that you might enjoy this video right here, so go and check it out.